I am Tom Williamson, Assistant Head Teacher for Teaching and Learning at Gumley House School. I will be introducing you to the Develop Your A-Level Teaching programme for 2024 to 25. Our theme for this year is how do we build resilience in students to elevate their independent practice, to include their independent study, in turn boosting the depth, quality and accuracy of student work. A working group of senior leaders from REACH, the Green School for Girls, Chiswick, Kingsley Academy and myself at Gumley have all contributed to the design of this programme. The agendas for meetings 1 and 2 have been centrally planned with the purpose of all delegates, regardless of their subject, having the same common focus rooted in educational research. Meetings 1 and 2 begin with a pre-release keynote. This is intended to be the stimulus for discussion during subject meetings. All delegates should watch the keynote before their subject meeting, committing that time to prepare so that everyone gets the most out of the meeting on the day. The subject meetings then enable teachers to have the time to share and collaborate with us in asking the question, how can the content of the keynote be effectively applied within my subject? Meeting 3 does not have a keynote. Each group can choose their own focus on what they would like to discuss. Each group will plan their meeting 3 agenda at the end of meeting 2. For those who were involved in the DAT program last year, the keynote is still available on YouTube and the link has been shared with you. Whilst last year had a different focus of introducing new knowledge and checking for understanding, the modal model of memory underpins both programs. This is insofar as effortful thinking, which is our focus for meeting 1, better enable students to encode learning into their long-term memory so that it can be retrieved at a future time. In meeting 1, as previously mentioned, our big question is, what is effortful thinking? How do we breed good independent practice habits with our students? There are 3 sections to the keynote. Firstly, addressing what effortful thinking looks like in the classroom. Then secondly, you will see an example of a teacher setting up an independent practice task and encouraging that effortful thinking with her students. And then finally, there will be further details around what to expect from your subject meeting and how best to prepare for it to ensure that you and those colleagues that you'll be meeting with all get the most out of the session. My colleague Audrey Douglas from Green School for Girls is now going to focus on what effortful thinking looks like in the classroom.
Hello, my name is Audrey Douglas. I'm Senior Assistant Head Teacher at the Green School for Girls. I've taught A-Level Art for many years and part of my role is also looking at evidence-based research into learning. Today we will identify what is effortful thinking and what it looks like in our classrooms to develop our A-Level teaching. The key cognitive principles from the memory model, we'll just recap on these. Securing attention through explicit instruction. That working memory is finite, so we need to consider cognitive load. Building knowledge. As students learn new ideas, they connect these to what they know in their schema. And cognitive engagement to facilitate that transfer of knowledge to long-term memory. That's what we want to do so they can recall it and use it. And retrieval processes, using that long-term memory and making meaningful connections in their schema to strengthen their memory by using interleaving and space practice. All of those sound quite familiar from Barrett Browsenshine's principles, first published in 2010, and he found that the most successful teachers spent more time in guided practice, asking questions, checking for understanding, and correcting misconceptions. And that's about securing concepts in memory, but how do we create, in doing that, those opportunities for more effortful thinking? Well, the Deans for Impact are a group of deans in Austin State University, Texas, and They're committed to ensuring that every child is taught by a well-prepared teacher, bringing the science of learning into teaching practice to improve it. So they've published in recent papers, the first one on the science of learning, and then practice with purpose. And the one we're going to look at explicitly today is deepening meaning in learning, and how future teachers are putting learning science into action to support all learners. Now, that paper was really some analysis based on how successful the impact of their original vision has been. And they've looked at these key principles, very similar to Rosenshine's, in their research and their teacher training. And the first one is about connecting the dots, and that's about connecting ideas and schema, managing the learning load, deepening meaning and learning, and we'll focus on this one today. And the other three are practicing with purpose, building feedback loops, creating an motivating environment. So they can't really be taken individually as a whole, but we will focus on just this aspect for today because we want to really get that deepen meaning and learning so students are doing more effortful thinking. So what does effortful thinking look like in the classroom? Deans for Impact have said that it's about analysing and justifying, prompts for students to analyse and justify and explain ideas to be remembered. It's about spacing effortful prompts throughout the lesson and prioritising that instructional time so that you've got time to process them. Students can pause and think about those key ideas before moving on. And it's about including all learners, offering prompts to all, not just some students. So if we think about cold calling, we think about ways to check in that all the learners are on task and thinking deeply. So we're going to compare prompts for effortful thinking in the classroom with a task, what it might look like and what we could try instead. So the teacher's questioning to check understanding, they move on as soon as someone gets the answer, but instead they could say to everyone, take a moment and jot down your thinking on this. Not to be using one word answers. So for instance, if you ask a who or a what question, the students can probably answer with one word. But if you ask a why or a how, they've got to justify and explain. And questions that don't seem to involve their processing. So teachers may ask questions not all students think deeply about. So it's really about responding to that student's answer and building it further and getting them to really explain their thinking and their definitions. And they can do that to their partners, so all feel involved in that, the learning in the lesson. So sometimes we might be looking at our classroom and think, what does effortful thinking really look like? Is this what it is, I wonder? So students are busy, lots of work is done, students engaged, students are getting attention and feedback, the classroom's nice and calm, the curriculum's been covered, and some students are answering questions. Well, Professor Rob Couves says these are poor proxies for learning and poor proxies for effortful thinking. And he just explains that students have not really understood, they might not be able to reproduce the answers independently, they might have forgotten this topic by next week or tomorrow, and they already knew how to do this anyway. So Rob Couves says, deep learning happens when people have to think hard, effortful thinking. So it's about challenging students to identify the reason why an activity is taking place, asking a large number of questions and checking responses of all, raising different types of questions to justify process. Give time for students to respond to questions, spacing out the study, so that's interleaving and use spaced practice, and so that we can come back and recall that information to strengthen it. Well, student thinking versus student engagement. What can we do to differentiate between that illusion, between just engagement and effortful thinking? Well, there's some activities you could do to number the groups 1 to 4, ask each student in the group, for instance, those questions. So you might ask on number 1 people, what were your opinions on? Can you justify and explain this? Or you could do stop and jot, where students write a response to an individually to a prompt. Everyone gets a chance to answer. You can also do turn and talk, and they can share. And then again, it's having that evidence that all are learning and you're checking in with all. Now, what we do know from Dan Willingham, that people are naturally curious, but we're not naturally good thinkers unless the cognitive conditions are right. We will avoid that stretch in our thinking. The implication is that teachers need to reconsider how they encourage their students to think. And in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Loud, he describes it's very similar to our classrooms, that students could avoid challenges and are limited just using their prior knowledge. So how do we counteract this? Instead of System 1 thinking, which is easy, apply System 2, hard, slow and effortful thinking demanding more logic and calculation. So instead of just skimming past perhaps a quote in the book they're reading, we should actually be asking them, how relevant is this? Is it ironic? How serious is it? Is it philosophical? But we need to pitch that effort just right. And if we go back to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development that we all probably learnt when we were training our teachers, it connects with that System 2 thinking, which is probably putting students in that middle zone so that they may struggle, but with prompts, they will be able to work really well independently. So does our teaching elicit the right degree of thinking and cognitive load? How difficult will they find the task? If it's too difficult, they will disengage. So what we need to use is good germane cognitive load, and that's using things like mind maps, graphic organisers, so that students can recall from memory and schema that foundational knowledge that will help them do that effortful thinking. And what does it look like in practice then, effortful thinking? Let's recap. Identify the effortful tasks and opportunities for effortful thinking in your lessons and classrooms. Trim non-essential tasks that don't build thinking or foundational knowledge. Create good germane cognitive load, think of Vygotsky, and scaffold to remember that effortful thinking. Provide explicit processing prompts and check that all students know. Check in with all the students learning. Apply System 2 thinking, requiring more logic, and use moments like stop and jot or turn and talk so they can discuss answers and then check all. Any opportunities to collaborate and develop responses, we do need to check everyone's doing it. And of course, asking those deeper questions for more effortful thinking. Compare, is it relevant, justify, why and how. Now I'm going to pass on to Gill, who will speak about the subject meeting and what teachers can expect next. Thank you.
Good morning, Year 13. It was our timed essay practice session this morning. You've gone away, you've learnt an essay for me. What we're going to use this morning is our 2-colour method during our timed essay practice. So, raise your 2 colours. Good, Year 13. So, our first colour pen, I'm going to be asking you to retrieve everything that you possibly can from memory. And during that process, you're going to be carrying out your effortful thinking. You're going to be working really, really hard to recall all that essay detail and all the structure that we've been learning about. When you feel that you can't do any more, you're going to pick up your second colour pen and you're going to use your notes to add detail. What that's going to give you, Year 13, is that's going to give you a really clear area of where you need to work on. So you're going to have a visual representation of the area that you were a little bit unsure about. And what it's going to give me is an indication of what you know and what you don't know, so I can help you to fill in those gaps. So why are we doing this then? The first process is allowing you for that deeper thinking. You're going to be working really hard using retrieval practice. And the second process is helping you to give that visual feedback for your next steps. Okay, brilliant. Tim, why are we using 2 pens today?
Mostly pens to differentiate between what we know and what we need to improve on in our knowledge.
Good, so what we know and what we need to improve on, fantastic. Leandria, what's happening during the first colour pen?
We're trying to recall everything that we know so that we can do retrieval practice.
Perfect, so you're recalling everything that you know through retrieval practice. Why are we using a second colour pen, Mariska?
We're trying to fill in the gaps by adding details that provides us with a visual representation of what we need to know.
Fantastic, it's going to give you that visual representation that you're going to use for your next steps. Okay, year 13, so we have the essay title on the board that you've been practicing. Can I ask you now to take your first colour pen, without looking at your notes, can you make a start please? Thank you. In this final section of the keynote, I'll talk you through what you should expect from your subject meetings and how you can prepare for them. In your up and coming meetings, all sessions will follow the same structure. They're all divided into 3 sections. It starts with the initial reflections on the keynote discussion. You'll be in small groups to share ideas from the keynote and your initial thoughts. You'll get a chance to model and rehearse. This is where the action happens. In small groups, you'll model how you set out independent tasks in front of one another. Don't worry, this is a supportive environment and designed to give you some feedback so you can implement that into your classroom. And then action going forwards. Finally, we'll wrap up with a conversation about next steps and how you can implement what you've practiced into your classroom for best effect. So get ready for a session filled with collaboration, practice and planning to improve how your students engage in deep and effortful thinking. We're going to focus on how you are better able to introduce independent tasks in your classroom. But let me clarify, we're not going to be making new tasks. We've got plenty of those. Instead, we're focusing on how you can set up that task to engage your students. Effortful thinking is key. It's that slightly uncomfortable feeling when students struggle through and push through that challenge. So it's not about making it easy for our students, it's helping them to understand why it should feel hard. And we can link that back to the science of learning and memory. So think about, how do you explain why it should feel hard? What do your students already know about cognitive science and that mode or model of memory? How do you model that feeling of it being quite uncomfortable and a bit tricky? Why does it matter? Well, especially for our high achieving students, those trying to get A's and A stars, effortful thinking builds resilience. It teaches them that real learning often feels like hard work. And we can relate to this. When we've had to learn a new skill or some new bit of learning, we know it takes persistence and we know it takes time. So teaching our students, it's not just about getting the right answer, it's about embedding that learning so it sticks. If we can guide our students through that process of sticking with that tricky material, they'll be far better equipped to tackle new challenges, both inside the classroom and beyond. So when you're setting up that independent task, how can you make sure that the students are truly engaging with it? Thinking back to our pointers, how do you link it to prior learning? Explicitly narrating to students what's gone before, and why this task builds upon what they've already covered. Using strategies like the 2-pen method, getting them to complete as much from memory as they possibly can, and then switching pens so they've got that visual representation of what they need to work on. How do you frame the challenge? Explaining to students that it should feel hard, and that's okay. And you can use analogies from sport, learning, practicing, and that progress comes from pushing us to the limits. Teaching them how to use those resources, not for quick fixes, but using their notes and materials and making sure they're using it to think effortlessly. So in your upcoming subject meetings, you'll get a chance to model, rehearse, and set up that independent practice in front of your colleagues. It might feel a bit uncomfortable at first, but remember, this is a really powerful way to improve our practice. Everyone in the room is there to learn from each other. So think of it as a safe space where you can fine-tune your approach and then bring that approach back to your students. So to prepare for that subject meeting, we'd like you to bring an example of an independent practice task that you've already used with your class. The idea is to see how you can use this task and further refine it to encourage that effortful thinking. Try it out in your classroom beforehand and then bring back your observations from how your students engage with it and be ready to share those observations with your peers. And be ready to be brave and model that in front of your colleagues. Whether you've been teaching for a few months or many years, it can take you out of your comfort zone. But remember, it's a real opportunity to push through that discomfort, and you'll be in a room full of supportive teachers, and we're all there to learn from each other. So lean into that uncomfortable feeling of modelling in front of others that you may have just met, because everyone's going to contribute and hopefully grow from that experience. Think about any additional success criteria that you might want to add. What else could help your students embrace that uncomfortable feeling? How can we refine our process to make it as effective as possible in the classroom? So this meeting is a fantastic opportunity to focus entirely on your subject, to share ideas and learn from others. It's about moving engagement to a deeper thinking, which we know is really crucial in helping our students truly master material. So let's get ready to set up those independent tasks in a way that will drive real, long-lasting learning. And remember, it's about making sure our students think deeply and not just skim through those tasks. Because we know as teachers that deep learning comes from those moments of challenge when students really persevere and push through that difficulty. Thanks for your time and commitment and for really leaning into that process. Let's make our classrooms a place where thinking hard becomes the norm and where that effort leads to real, long-lasting learning. Thank you.